The Monsters That Made Us is brought to you by the Cage Club Podcast Network. For all things movies, music, media, monsters, and more, head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. How do you do? We feel it would be a little unkind to present this podcast without just a word of friendly warning. We're about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image without reckoning upon God. It is one of the strangest tales ever told. It deals with the two greatest mysteries of creation, life and death. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. So if any of you feel you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to... well, we warned you.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Listen to them, children of the night.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? I'll show you who I am and what I am.
You're insane. I tell you, I killed a wolf, a plain, ordinary wolf.
By studying these and other species, we add to our knowledge of how life evolved, how it adapted itself to this world.
He went for a little walk. He could see his face.
Welcome to The Monsters That Made Us, the podcast where we celebrate the spooktacular characters and films in the Universal Studios classic Monsters series. Today we're talking about the original horror show, James Whale's electrifying 1931 production of Frankenstein, starring the uncanny Boris Karloff. I'm the invisible Dan Colón, and joining me as always is my co-host and lab assistant, Monster Mike Manzi. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, how's it going? That's my Frankenstein impression.
As is the titular monster, Universal's Frankenstein is a film stitched together from multiple sources. Most notably, of course, Mary Shelley's original 1818 novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, as well as the 1927 play Frankenstein, written by Peggy Webling and produced by Hamilton Dean, who listeners should remember from our Dracula episode. But like Dracula, Frankenstein and his creation have inspired countless projects over the years, from films to plays to TV sitcoms, and Jack Pierce's creature design is quite possibly the most famous in horror movie history. So Mike, where did you have your first encounter with Frankenstein?
Yeah, I knew you'd be asking me this, so I really tried to rack my brain hard to figure out the first time that I was sort of conscious of Frankenstein, the monster Frankenstein. That's something I learned later in life, that the creature had no name, but I definitely referred to it as Frankenstein growing up as a little kid. It's hard to say. I think, to be quite honest, I grew up at a very young age collecting comics, and I think the first sort of connection I made with Frankenstein was with the Incredible Hulk.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you got like Dr. Banner, and he's, a mad scientist, and, he turns into the creature. He doesn't create it, but the Hulk is this big green mass, like he just roams the countryside hurting people, and that kind of, I guess, for me is sort of the first, when I look back, that's like the first connection I have with Frankenstein. I mean, he showed up on those Abbott and Costello movies for sure, and his image was just burned into the public consciousness by the time I came around. This movie was already, like 50 years old when I was a kid in the 80s or so. So maybe there was even like a universal renaissance because of the anniversary or something. And also, Frankenstein is probably perceived now as one of the more benevolent monsters. Like, it's funny to say because he murders a child in this movie, but in a weird kind of way, like I was never really scared of him. So it was always more attractive as like an image and things like that. I was always very curious about it. And I'm sure I had like color forms, and Scooby-Doo ran into him at some point and all that kind of thing along the way.
Sure. I thought about this myself quite a bit. I think I mentioned in our introductory episode, I had two of the Universal Monster films on VHS. I had Frankenstein and I had The Mummy. So as a kid, at some point I had watched that and was pretty indoctrinated into this original Frankenstein pretty early. Before that, I can only imagine that my only experience with a Frankenstein monster was Frankenberry cereal.
Yes, awesome.
Or actually, if it wasn't Frankenberry, it could have also been the Munsters. I grew up with the Munsters.
Oh, totally. Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so some people grew up with the Addams Family. I grew up in a Munsters house. Herman Munster clearly has a Jack Pierce Frankenstein look, just like Lily has the bride look and Grandpa has a Dracula look.
They are the universal monsters as a family unit.
100%. Yeah, I think if not this original 1931 Frankenstein, then definitely I got some experience with, Frankenberry cereal and the Munsters, as silly as that is.
I think that's great. The Munsters, you totally just jogged my memory. I loved that show growing up. That was a comedy, so it just never occurred to me that he was supposed to be scary, right? Because he is sort of like Homer Simpson on that show.
Yeah, totally.
And you're right. Yeah, I definitely watched that before I saw this movie. I think I mentioned in our intro episode when we were just talking about our history before we reviewed Phantom of the Opera, some kid in 5th grade, I remember making a big fuss that Igor wasn't his assistant. It was Fritz.
Oh, right.
Around that time was when I first saw this movie properly, and then it had been years and years later, and it's still been like a decade since I've seen this movie, so it was awesome to rewatch it.
Yeah, I watched this one a handful of times every year or so. Usually around Halloween it comes on because I want to watch an old Universal horror film. This being my all-time favorite of this series, this is the one that usually gets brought out the most. Sort of showed my hand a little bit. I'm a huge Frankenstein fan. Where does Frankenstein sort of fall for you in terms of the overall hierarchy of these characters?
He definitely is at the top. They're all so close, you know what I mean? It's very hard to sort of put one in front of the other, but there's just something about Frankenstein that is different, because I feel like this is something that's been brought up. He seems to be the only one of these, well, kind of until we get to the creature of the Black Lagoon, which is sort of questionable, if he's part human or not. He's the only one of these universal monsters that's not a person, right? So the Dr. Frankenstein, Henry, is a monster, and then we get the Wolfman, who is a man that turns into a monster, and the Invisible Man becomes the man that's
right.
So there's something kind of special just because of that this is the creature that was created out of nothing kind of instance. Even Dracula was human once. So I think he sort of stands above in my mind, if not just because of that. Even if he's not necessarily my favorite, I love him. This movie is definitely an incredible movie, visually and everything. It is just gorgeous. It's so insane. So I definitely believe he's at the top of the heap. He's king of the monsters, I guess, until Godzilla shows up.
Yeah, I kind of said it before, but I would say that he's probably the most famous in terms of iconography. There are people who may not recognize some of the other characters in this canon, but Frankenstein is so unique and so distinct. I mean, we put him on our logo, for Pete's sake, So, yeah, I think he stands alone at the top as perhaps the most iconic of these characters. He definitely is high on my list. I think as a kid, I really related to the monster. I think I always found him to be a sympathetic character. Did some reading in my research. Frankenstein monster has historically been very popular with kids. Even though, this movie played very differently in 1931, it was very terrifying and very intense. Kids always seem to gravitate towards the creature because he's so childlike. He just wants to be loved and be accepted, right? But society turns him into a monster. So that always kind of spoke to me. But I think far and away, the movie is maybe the absolute best that Universal put out in this series.
Just to compare it quickly to the movies we've seen so far, Phantom and Dracula felt so grounded in a sort of realism. And this feels like a fairy tale. This feels like a Grimm's fairy tale or something. And it looks like one too. It looks like you're watching a storybook or even a play with the background. But it works so perfectly. The material and everything and the style. It's such a perfect marriage. There's levels of expressionism, and this is peak. This is madness on display. And it's great. It works so well for the material.
Yeah, and it's kind of a miracle that it worked out that way, right? Because this production, just like the previous two, were not perfectly smooth productions. Frankenstein definitely had its ups and downs in terms of production. Where it started is very different from where it ended up. Actually, let's get into that, because I think that the story of the making of this film is just as interesting as the film itself. Universal's riding high on Dracula, and they knew they needed the next thing, right? Junior Lamley was the guy who really spearheaded the horror with Universal, and in his mind, there was really only one other book to go to, and it was going to be Frankenstein. Frankenstein was a hugely successful novel. It was published in 1818, written by Mary Shelley, and in a handful of years, there were at least 5 plays that were adapted from it. So even in its own time, the novel was hugely successful. Everybody wanted to adapt it. So Universal purchased the rights for the book, and they also purchased the rights for a specific play. It was a play that was published in 1927, written by Peggy Webling, produced for Hamilton Dean's production company. It was a play that she wrote for Hamilton Dean to produce and star in, because he was also an actor. So Universal purchased both of these for a total of $20,000, and that was going to be the basis for their film. And initially, they had hired a guy named Robert Florey to direct it. And of course, the star of this movie was going to be Bela Lugosi. In fact, there's a famous one sheet. I'm sure you've seen the one sheet of Frankenstein with Bela Lugosi's name attached to it.
Yes.
It's a great poster, and if you haven't seen it, I think you should definitely look it up, because it's this cool little like curio of a film that almost was.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Revenge of the Jedi poster.
Yes,
Changed
yes.
the title before it came out.
And so Robert Florey is the guy who did a lot of the development early on. He's primarily the guy responsible for all of the German Expressionist style of this film, because we talked about how Phantom and how Dracula have a very clear German Expressionist influence, or at least they appear very European at the very least, right? Frankenstein is like wall-to-wall German Expressionist, right?
It may as well be like a Fritz Lang movie or something. It really is. Like, they tapped into that 100%.
And so in the early stages of this development, there were a lot of people attached to this script. Robert Florey contributed to the script, another man, John Russell. Ultimately, the two who were credited for the screenplay were Francis Edward Farrago and Garrett Fort. So there were a lot of hands in this pot. And of course, John L. Balderston contributed some things. We'll also remember him from Dracula. He was sort of Universal's guy. Like, he took the play in this case and then cleaned it up before it got ready for the script for Universal.
And it's funny when in the credits, like, all these people seem to be credited, and you see kind of like the different versions they're pulling from, right? It's like the screenplay adapted from the stage play, adapted from the book. Like, it's kind of funny, but it worked.
Yeah, it's interesting how, like, so we have, what, 5 guys now, plus the scenario editor, Richard Schayer.
And whatever Mary Shelley wrote from the novel, right?
So we've got 7 people all connected to the story that this movie ended up being, which is insane.
No one bought the Thomas Edison version to crib from.
We've got 7 people at least involved in the story of this, and they're all kind of pulling from different things. For example, the original novel has no lab assistant. We know Fritz is the lab assistant in this. That character originated on the stage in a play, and he was brought into this film by John L. Balderston. When he cleaned up Peggy Webling's play, he added Fritz to the film. And then we have, little things like Victor becomes Henry, and Henry becomes Victor, and I'm not really sure why. In some versions of the script, Victor was Elizabeth's old fiance, and now she's in like this kind of arranged marriage with Henry Frankenstein.
The movie was sort of also like removed from any specific time period. The only technology in it that seems to exist is in Henry's lab. There's no cars, there's nothing modern of convenience, and yet it's where? Like, it might as well take place in Bavaria. Like, there's no telling. And I feel like that's sort of another, like, organic evolution of the parts of the changes that have been, put to this material. And I think that's great, too, to give it this sort of, like, it can happen whenever sort of situation. Like, it's part medieval, it's part futuristic, it's all of it.
I do feel like that could have been found in the whole development process, but I do believe at the end of the day that was an intentional decision, because the director of this film, we'll get into what happened to Robert Florey, but, James Whale, the director of this film, came from a theatrical background. That was his thing, and he had only directed a few films prior to this. So I think that he had intended for this film to stand, like, or to exist outside of time and space as we know it. Like, it all feels familiar. It's got elements that we understand, like it clearly takes place kind of in a Bavarian area. Could be Germany, could be Austria. The name Frankenstein kind of means that he's got to be in that part of Europe, right? And then we've got corpses hanging like along the road, which is a very medieval thing.
Yeah, gallows and stuff, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then his watchtower with his lab is all very gothic. And of course the fashion is very 1930s. So yeah, I think I kind of like that idea. I'd never thought about it beforehand before I had to really watch it and examine it. It makes perfect sense. This film is very anachronistic in that way, and I kind of like that they did it that way. The other 2 films we've watched already are very grounded in reality. You can kind of pinpoint when and where they are. This this one doesn't do any of that, doesn't obey any of those rules.
And it's very subconscious. Like, it took me till this viewing at my age to really put my finger on that and to listen to 2 audio commentaries sort of explaining it to me for it to sort of lock in my mind and be like, oh yeah, like it's something that was always sort of in the back of my mind. There's something off about this situation I can never put my finger on. And I feel like that's kind of it, like that's what they were getting at.
For sure. Let's get into what happened with Robert Florey and Bela Lugosi. Robert Florey filmed about 20 minutes of his vision of Frankenstein. It was mostly the lab sequence with the reanimation of Frankenstein monster. I suppose that also worked as a screen test for Bela Lugosi playing the monster himself. And at the time, Robert Florey, like I said, was really invoking a lot of what had already been done with German Expressionism. The films that we know for sure that influenced Frankenstein were Metropolis, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and The Golem. Based on some photos that I saw, the Frankenstein monster look at the time was very much inspired by The Golem.
That's what the Edison version looks almost exactly like.
So I've seen that version. That does things sort of wildly different in that, like, Frankenstein is like an alchemist, right? The creature comes up out of a cauldron, right? It takes a lot of liberties with this story.
Yeah, I think it was more of like a camera test and a special effects reel at the time to see, like, this is the possibilities. Edison wasn't really known as a director, he made movies, but they're more like samples, I feel.
Sure. Bela Lugosi's Frankenstein monster, in my humble opinion, didn't really get an honest shake, Like, he was kind of set up to fail because he looked so ridiculous in that particular makeup. And the account that I had researched was that Carl Laemmle Jr. took one look at him in the makeup and just laughed.
That's not a good sign. Yeah, you never want that to happen.
No, and then he also didn't speak very highly of Robert Florey's footage either. I think the quote that I read was that it was not very good.
Well, so what I heard was that Bela didn't even know he was testing for the creature. He thought he was playing Frankenstein, the Dr. Frankenstein, and that would have been awesome. He would have been a great Dr. Frankenstein. I'm already scared of him because he was Dracula. I feel like he could perpetrate atrocity.
In hindsight, like, we know that he has gone on to play mad scientist type characters. If they had gone that route, I don't know that I would have enjoyed that either. Bela is just made to play these big, larger than life characters. And one of the things that I love about Colin Clive in this film is that he's one of the only, like, real grounded, realistic things in this film. I buy him as this guy who wanted to achieve this goal, right? This thing he had set out to do. If it were Bela, I could see him just sort of twisting it a little bit and making it more broad and maybe making Henry Frankenstein a little more nefarious.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point about Colin Clive, and I'm sure we'll talk more about him, but to be the most insane character of the movie, he does actually feel like the most realistic. He's like the best actor, I think. Well, he's like a completely compassionate type of man once, when you get to the core of him. Like, he's got a god complex, obviously, but he's not out to hurt anybody. He's actually he thinks this is going to help everything going on. And yet, he kind of looks very ghoulish to me on his own, and that's not to say he's not a good-looking person or that he's ugly. There's just something, again, he's got a very sort of sunken face. He's got sort of like big features, he almost like, it almost looks like maybe they did something to enhance that to sort of say is more of a parallel to when the creature arrives, that like, oh look, like they both sort of look alike in a lot of ways, like they parallel each other in that way.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until you just said it, but you're right in that both Colin Clive and Boris Karloff like have that sort of like they have thin frames and sort of skeletal faces. Karloff's was emphasized by the makeup, but yeah, there is a lot of similarity there, and I don't think that was a mistake. I think if you had had Bela Lugosi playing Frankenstein, I don't know that you would have had that same quality. They could have been accidental, could have been intentional, I'm not sure, but with Bela, I don't think you would have gotten it.
Yeah, he'll play the creature eventually, and I think things worked out just fine for this movie. They got enough holdovers from Dracula as it is that we're going to talk about, so we didn't really need another one.
Right. As for Bela Lugosi playing the monster or not playing the monster, as history tells us, there are different stories, of course, of what really happened. If Ed Wood is to be believed, that's the movie Ed Wood, then Bela decided he didn't want to play the monster because it wasn't sexy enough. It was all makeup and grunting,
it's all grunting. I know, that's an Academy Award-winning performance. Like, it's so good.
But yeah, I mean, that's an exaggerated version of that story. But yeah, there is a version of this story where Bela was riding high off of Dracula and was on to the next thing. And when he was presented with Frankenstein, he said, no, of course I'm not going to do this.
There's like this whole rivalry set up, like, you know, Karloff doesn't deserve to smell my shit and like all this stuff. But yet they end up making so many movies together. You know, they end up kind of becoming friends and like, you know, friendly rivals. Like, I almost see them as like the Stallone and Schwarzenegger of their times at some point.
I think that under normal circumstances, this is a role that Bela could have gotten himself, like he could have really sunk his teeth into. I don't think he was that much of a prima donna. I mean, this is just my own conjecture here, but Bela made it seem as though he was above that role in order to save face, because it's better for him to tell that story than to admit that he was sort of laughed out of the studio because of that makeup. I think that's probably a little bit of both.
History meets somewhere in the middle, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think he would have been a great monster. So like, as you said, he does go on to play the monster, but of course the studio didn't really help him out there either. So I think in a lot of ways, Bela Lugosi caught a raw deal after Dracula. You know, he's a guy who should have been a huge movie star, independent of Boris Karloff. He just never got that break that he needed. He was always playing kind of second fiddle to Karloff when they were paired up together. Really kind of sad because Bela was great.
Also, I've come to find out that like Boris Karloff pretty much like embraced the idea that he was Frankenstein, whereas it seemed Bela, you know, and this again is conjecture from my end, is that like he kind of wanted to distance himself a little bit from that, to be like, I could do more, I could do other things and stuff. And like James Whales and Boris Karloff are gonna do the old Dark House together in like a year or two, right? So like you could sort of see like a working relationship probably was developed under those circumstances. I don't want to say like Bela was the prima donna or anything like that, but it just seems unusual that, you know, there's a guy who for all I can understand is like saying, I don't want to do stuff like Dracula anymore. And then Boris Karloff, who's like, yeah, I'll do tons of stuff like Frankenstein. One was able to like embrace what was happening, and the other was just kind of like didn't understand how or something.
I'm just remembering another angle to this whole story. So when Robert Florey was, I guess, let go and James Whale was hired on to direct Frankenstein, there's another version of this story where James Whale dismissed Bela Lugosi himself because he didn't want the same guy playing both Dracula and his Frankenstein monster. James Whale wanted to distance himself from Dracula a little bit. So, you know, it may not have been up to Bela at all, you know, but I certainly understand his point of view and his frustration with Frankenstein. We may never know the full story. So now we've got James Whale directing Frankenstein, and he had seen Boris Karloff, I think, on the Universal lot and just was sort of taken with his unique look. If there's anyone who's ever seen Boris Karloff, you know he's got kind of an interesting face already. And so he cast Boris Karloff as his monster. Now, Karloff had an interesting career. He had done 80 films before Frankenstein and wasn't making much money as an actor, so in his free time, he was driving trucks. You know, can you believe, like, Boris Karloff, who became, like, the face of Universal horror, had been working for that long, making 80 films and just working as a truck driver on the side. You know, it's insane that this one movie just blew up his whole career.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's a fun story his daughter tells on the behind the scenes where he was like looking his finest and dressed to the nines in the commissary when James Whale spotted him and was like, "You're my monster, you're the creature." And he's like, "Well, I don't know how to feel about that. Like, I thought I was kind of good looking, and now he sees like this monster in me." But you know, again, like he took it with a great assault. Like he was such a good sport about all of it.
Yes, by all accounts, Boris Karloff was a very gentle, generous man and was loved by everybody. So I totally believe that he would have had some sort of gracious response to that.
When I was a little kid, like I knew him from other stuff, you know, like he famously is the narrator to the Grinch Who Stole Christmas cartoon. And I remember when I was sort of studying the Roger Corman School of Filmmaking, like he pops up in Francis Ford Coppola's like first movie. There's some extra stock footage or something of him from another old movie with like Dick Miller. It's crazy. Like he worked until he passed away, and he was in the hands of people who loved and respected him until he was out, still making horror movies and doing it for people who grew up loving him. So I mean, it's just such an amazing career.
I don't think we really have an actor quite like him today, you know.
I mean, it's hard to say, like, who's made that many. Like, I think of Sam Jackson, right? Like, there's a guy who every generation is going to know about. Like, he just transcends so much time in cinema that it's hard to sort of think of it without him. And that's how I think of Karloff must have come across. I can't remember movies without this guy.
You know how like a lot of actors will turn to horror when they need to make a paycheck, you know, like they need some extra cash. He was always very grateful of his place within the horror film community, and he always knew, you know, it's where I think it's where he felt appreciated and respected, and good for him, man. He just kept going back to that well. And that's not to say he's always made good movies. He's made some real crap over the years, but he always seemed very appreciative of horror films for giving him a career, you know, and never resented that. Okay, so we've got Karloff in the role. Let's talk about his makeup, okay? Because I think when people think of Frankenstein, they think of this look. Now, there are a couple people attributed to the look of the Frankenstein monster. Of course, Jack Pierce was the head of the makeup department at the time, and he got the credit for the execution of this makeup effect. But according to different stories, now, again, this might be one of the situations where, you know, history meets in the middle, but I can certainly say that James Whale and Jack Pierce both contributed to this ultimate final product of what Karloff looked like in this makeup.
It's so minimalist. It feels like this sort of game of adding and subtracting. Take a little away from here, add a little bit there, and this, and then they all, by committee, somehow created a horse instead of a camel, like they set out to do. It's really something.
Yeah, so much about this movie just kind of is a metaphor for the monster himself.
This patchwork production.
Absolutely. Of course, the flat top head is attributed to James Whale. If we want to believe Gods and Monsters with Ian McKellen, he claims that was his idea, you know, to have the head open up like a can so you can just drop a new brain in there. And then we've got little things like Karloff himself had like a dental appliance in his mouth that he was able to remove, and then he sort of sucked in his cheek, and then that was sort of emphasized by Jack Pierce.
Like, a lot of it just seems like, okay, practical kind of thing. Like, Karloff, like, what can you do? Oh, well, I have a bridge I can take out. Let's see how that looks. And oh, great, you look like more like a skeleton. And then it's like, well, let's see, like, how do you get the brain in this thing? Well, you got to chop the top off, right? So it's just like, clearly he needs a flat top, a couple stitches here and there. He needs bolts in the neck because you got to hook up the electricity somewhere. Like, it's really neat how it all just feels like enough, like just what they needed, but nothing more really.
Right. It's just scientific enough that my brain's willing to accept it and say, yeah, of course, this is how you would reanimate dead tissue, right? You would sew a body together.
Yeah, you can see the stitches. It makes so much sense. It's so visceral when you're like, oh my God, that's like, you can see where the hand is like sewn on. You know, nowadays that's gruesome. I couldn't imagine back then seeing like a huge gash in this dude's forehead, being like, what the hell? I could see his brain? Like, what am I supposed to be seeing?
And of course, other things that I didn't even think about, you know, because we think of the Frankenstein monster, he's very tall, right? Why is he very tall? Well, I found out that Jack Pierce was thinking about, you know, what happens to bodies when they die, right? And of course, blood sort of settles into the lowest parts of the body. So in his mind, of course, the monster would have big swollen feet. So that's why he's got these like big giant boots on to accommodate his big swollen dead feet. And even little things, there's like dark makeup on the fingernails. Like, that's the reason that the Frankenstein monster has black fingertips, because all the blood's settling in the bottoms of his fingers. This was all kind of a group project, if you will. Everyone sort of contributed a little bit to the creation of this monster, and the fact that it stands as perhaps one of the most iconic, most famous images, if not the most, is incredible.
And they leave so much to the imagination also. Like, if you recall, you know, maybe one day we'll get to Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein starring Robert De Niro as the creature. And that's very off-putting because that is more sort of, I guess, medically accurate. Yet that's not what you need. Like, that's not what's necessary. Like, you need to leave some of that shit to the imagination. And so, like, I definitely remember as a kid thinking of, like, how many different skin tones is this dude under that jacket? Like, how mismatched are his body parts and things, you know? And now watching it now, I think I mentioned to you in a text, you know, it doesn't necessarily come across in this version, but it's there a little bit. I'm like, he's kind of like a cyborg. Nowadays, you'd look at him and be like RoboCop, you know? Like, RoboCop is the modern Frankenstein in a lot of ways. But back then, with the bolts in the neck and stuff, like, it just sort of got my mind turning. Like, they could have pushed this more in that direction and it would have worked just as well too. Now, I personally feel like this Frankenstein has more of an organic feel to it, that if anything, there's animal parts going on inside of him instead of like artificial ones. Either way, I think it just stokes the imagination so much.
Like, I don't necessarily agree with the robotic comparison in this film, but I do agree that the Frankenstein monster definitely becomes that over the course of the run of these films. He just starts to become this thing that whoever the villain of the movie is wants to use to achieve their goal, right? He's just there to assist in that task as opposed to being a character in his own right.
Yeah, another reference that I wasn't aware of until recently is that he's basically a zombie. He's like a somnambulist for a lot of his movie career, right? And like you're saying, in later ones, it's just like, go do this, right? And he'll do it. And he's kind of like order him. He's like remote controlled or something like that.
And that is straight out of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Anybody who's read the novel, the Frankenstein monster in the novel is not that sort of character at all. He's very intelligent, very well spoken.
He's the guy from Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman. Like, he's spouting Shakespeare. He's very literate. You know, he ponders too much. He just talks and talks.
Yeah, he is very much, in the novel, the monster is very much like the opposite side of the same coin as Victor Frankenstein. I think this movie is a little more interested in other themes. I think those themes exist in this film, but the whole sort of Faustian theme of overreaching past what man should be doing, like, that's the prevalent theme of this film.
Yeah. I mean, they even take off the subtitle, The Modern Prometheus. Everything is sort of shrunken down a little, maybe a little too much in some degrees, but it's still great melodrama too, right? Like, it has to play to the audience of the time, and you can't give them too much too soon. So it can't all be out of control, scary, and gory. So you can't cover every theme that way also. Like, you just can't fit it all in.
Right, of course. And this film, as we'll discuss, is a very, very condensed version of the book and the plays. You know, like, there's a lot of material to mine there. I think they found some really creative ways to condense, just like we did with Dracula. We've got our cast, Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein. Colin Clive had, of course, worked with James Whale previously on a World War I film called Journey's End. James Whale insisted on casting Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein in this production, which I thought was kind of a neat detail. I think James Whale had his players, right? He had the actors that he really liked and liked to stick with them as much as possible, as we learned from Boris Karloff as well.
For what I could tell, James Whale seems to be like a master who knows what he's doing. Like, I don't feel like many people questioned him, but yet also he was extremely like collaborative, right? Because he saw that they wanted to go in that expressionistic direction. So like, he will sample movies at the time. Like, there is a shot in here directly from Caligari towards the end when Frankenstein is creeping into the bedroom. Like, that painting The Nightmare, that is on display in here. Like, he is picking things from culture and putting them in his movie and like disguising it in Frankenstein.
So we've got Mae Clarke as Frankenstein's fiancée Elizabeth. Now, an interesting detail about her is that the only other person who was considered to play Elizabeth before Mae Clarke was Bette Davis, which is so wild. I'm not terribly well versed in Bette Davis's career. By 1931, would she have been,
I'm not so sure either, because the other thing I heard about Mae Clarke is that she was in James Cagney movie, right? Like, she was in, I think, was it Public Enemy maybe? Or like, she's the one who had the grapefruit squeezed in her face.
Yep.
She would have been kind of a leading lady at the time.
Okay, so I'm looking it up. 1931 was the very beginning of Bette Davis's career. So she wasn't Bette Davis yet. But still, like, this movie may have changed the trajectory of her career. It may have killed her career, because from what I understand, Mae Clarke's career didn't really go very far after this. Like, nobody in this movie, except for Boris Karloff, really like blew up.
It's funny, it could have been like one of the first instances of like how a lot of modern actors, or at least like 20 years ago, a lot of the actors who are famous today were like from horror movies, got their start in horror movies, like Johnny Depp in Nightmare on Elm Street, or Kevin Bacon in Friday the 13th. Would have been like, Mae West was in Frankenstein? Like, holy shit. She did all right for herself. She ended up playing in extremely scary characters in her later career, like Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte and things like that.
What's funny to me is that the reason she didn't get the part in Frankenstein is because Carl Laemmle Jr. did not think she had enough sex appeal.
Bette Davis' eyes became like synonymous for having above average beautiful looking eyes. eyes. It's like insane. Like, what was Junior thinking?
Isn't that wild? So we've got John Bowles as Victor, Boris Karloff, of course, as the monster. But how great is that credit at the beginning of the film when they show the list of the credits and it says the monster and there's just a question mark? That's a tradition that was held over from the theater. When productions of Frankenstein were done on stage, the program would just have a little question mark there for the monster.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like a modern uncredited role this important, and there just isn't, right? Like, this would just never happen.
So we've got Edward Van Sloan as Dr. Waldman.
Big carryover here.
Yes, very similar role. I mean, he's essentially playing this film's Van Helsing, although things go a little bit differently for him in this film.
Yeah, so he's Dr. Waldman, and I was thinking, man, if they had the foresight of modern executives, like, he would be the Nick Fury of the monster movies back then, because Edward Van Sloan's going to show up in The Mummy as another doctor, and it's just like, well, if he just wasn't murdered by the creature in this movie, it would have worked. He seems really close to Van Helsing in the sense of, like, he just wants to destroy this creature as soon as he finds out about it to save the, like, he's on the same wavelength for the most part.
Sure. He's also, the person with the most authority about these things, right? As Van Helsing, he knows more about vampires than anybody else in the room. In this film, he is Frankenstein's old professor. He was always very good, at least in these three films, playing the character who could really command that authority, right? We always trust him to know that he's well informed and knows what he's talking about. He knows his shit.
And they knew that we felt that because this is something I did not remember at all from any previous viewing. He comes out before the movie starts and gives us like a little warning speech. And that blew my mind. Like, this is stuff I attributed to later schlock stuff of like the 60s when Criswell would come out in Ed Wood movies and like give a little explanation of like what you're about to see is gonna boggle the mind and stuff. Like, this is awesome. I can't believe they were pulling gimmicks like this so early back in the day, where he's kind of like saying, if you can't handle this, there's like nurses in the lobby, or like, don't be afraid, like it's only a movie.
I read somewhere that Universal, in test screenings with Frankenstein, people were very put off by it. It's not really scary by contemporary standards. I think I view Frankenstein in 2020 as just a really beautiful kind of drama, and because I find that the monster to be so sympathetic. I don't really find it to be very scary, if scary at all. It's just, it doesn't have that same effect anymore. But in 1931, people were very put off by some of the things in this film, and we'll get to some of the scenes that had been cut out and censored because of how upset people were getting. And so Universal, anticipating some blowback from religious groups at the time, the movie's about a guy who playing God, and he wants to revive a dead body, which is, by definition, an abomination.
The very concept alone is so warped and disturbing. Even by today's standards, I feel like a lot of stuff in this movie is very fucked up. And so,
sure,
back then, definitely need a little warning sign.
Right. So I think that was Universal's attempt to sort of get out in front of that before the film was released and just let people know. And of course, I forgot to mention this on our Dracula episode, but Universal did do something very similar also with Edward Van Sloan at the end of Dracula, which had since been cut out and lost. We'll never see that footage, probably. Again, I meant to mention this on our last episode, but I figured now is a good time to bring it up because, it's pretty much the same kind of thing. Although it was cut out of Dracula because it sort of implied that vampires were real. It was less a warning and more of kind of like a fun little wink at the audience as a farewell. But again, religious groups kind of hated this encouragement, the studio suggesting that these sort of fantastical things were real. And so Universal cut it off the end of the film, and, it's been lost, so we may never see it. I love that this film begins with Edward Van Sloan, not as Waldman, of course. He's just kind of being himself. But as I said, he has this reputation of being an authority figure, so having him come out and address the audience is just a brilliant move, in my opinion.
Yeah, I loved it. And the perfect actor to do that, like, you wouldn't want Dwight Fry to come out and give you the warning because he's playing Fritz, like he's a maniac. You want the guy who's like the level-headed genius doctor who like kicked Frankenstein out of class because his ideas were insane.
And also you have to think about audiences at the time, like to follow your idea, a little further. If it were Dwight Fry, people had just seen him as this raving lunatic in Dracula. So maybe not the most trustworthy person to have out there, telling people it's just a movie. But yeah, so let's keep going down the cast list. We've got Frederick Kerr as Baron Frankenstein, who's incredible.
So that's Frankenstein's dad, right?
Yeah, that was an addition to this particular film. In the novel, Victor Frankenstein is not the son of a baron. He's just a scientist with high dreams, you know? I love Frederick Kerr as Baron Frankenstein in this, as we'll talk about. You know, this film ebbs and flows. It has, you know, these high moments of intensity, and then almost immediately, as if they realize that, they bring us back down with these scenes, sometimes with Baron Frankenstein, and they're like sort of comedy of manners type scenes, you know, very British, very James Whale. Like, that's definitely his contribution to this film, because as you and I probably know, James Whale had an incredible sense of humor and definitely knew how to use comedy to punctuate these intense films he was making.
I also like how in this movie we're sort of poking fun at the aristocrats, whereas in Dracula the comic relief was like the lowly orderly guy who's like the everyman. In this one it's more like, look at this rich idiot.
Exactly.
He has no idea what's going on but thinks he does, like assumes all this control and command but has none. Like, he's the ultimate buffoon. He's the perfect type of character to have in here because he could be a threatening presence because he thinks he is, but on top of everything else going on, like the dire seriousness of the actual situation, like he's a joke. And I love that.
Oh, totally. Yeah, and of course it's intentional. You know, he plays it perfectly, especially the scene with the Burgomaster. Has zero respect for the Burgomaster. It's amazing. The Burgomaster, played by Lionel Belmore. Get too far away from the Burgomaster.
He only has a couple of scenes, but again, like a very sort of grounded character where he's like just a guy doing his job and gets like no respect.
He is the chief law enforcement officer of this town and immediately is undermined at every turn by Baron Frankenstein the first time we ever meet him.
He's only like, oh, I'm just trying to get the entire town together for your son's wedding. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to corral like all the bakers, all the dancers, all the music, like it's all for you. And he's just like, whatever, man, like I have no time for you, get out of here.
So of course we have Dwight Fry. We mentioned Dwight Fry as Fritz, the assistant. Now Dwight Fry was cast specifically at the request of James Whale as well. James Whale had really loved him as an actor. Again, Whale came from the theater. I have to imagine he was familiar with Dwight Fry as a stage performer, but of course after Dracula, how could you not want to work with him again?
Stole the damn movie. They had to get rid of him quick in this one because he would have stolen this movie too, so they had to hang his ass and get him out of the picture.
James Whale worked with Dwight Fry a total of 5 times in his career. So, like, we'll get to Dwight Fry definitely some more before we're through with this podcast. We've got Lionel Belmore as the Burgomaster, Marilyn Harris as the little Maria, the little girl, and Michael Mark as Ludwig, Maria's father. So that's our principal cast.
Very small cast, very tight cast of characters, very tight movie too, right? Like an hour 15 minutes, like an hour 10. Like, I love these about these old monster movies. Like, I think we're gonna get one movie that's over 90 minutes throughout this entire run of our show.
It's awesome. It's one of the more fun things about this series of movies. You know, I don't know about you, Mike, but I'm in my 30s now, and when I want to put something on and I'm kind of torn between 2 choices, I'm almost always gonna go for the shorter movie. So many things are like 2.5, almost 3 hours long now. If I find something that's a cool 80 minutes, I'm putting that on immediately.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we talk about maybe they condense things a little too much, but if you're not familiar with like the source material and you don't know any difference, like it is precise. Like, it is great how like they get in and out of scenes, they convey the information that's absolutely necessary. There's really no dilly-dallying. There's nothing here that isn't supposed to be here for any real meaning or anything. It's awesome to see.
Well, of course, I think that there are some leaps in logic that have to be made with this particular film as a result of all of that condensing. I'm not as familiar with the novel as some. I'm able to enjoy this movie kind of on its own terms. Literally just crammed a whole bunch of this research into my head for this show. I didn't know some of it, but I've always loved the efficiency of this movie. The book is the book, and it's trying to accomplish a different task, I think. The themes are different, and that's cool. I'm not somebody who thinks that an adaptation has to be a good adaptation to be a good movie, right? I think if you can distill the essence of something down to this 110-minute film, and it works as a film, then it's a good film. It doesn't have to be a good adaptation, right?
And Frankenstein is so malleable as a story, and the creature as a character and everything like that. You can stray from the source material and it will still work. And I feel like it's not that there's different themes and stuff. There's just more in the book. And maybe that there's more than necessary. Like, I read the book a while ago, but yeah, there is sort of a whole different tone with the monster being more conscious. when you're trying to be more sort of economic, and certainly these were sort of low budget films at the time, and no one even really wanted them made in the first place, you just have to kill your darlings, chop and slice. For this version, I think everything that's here works really well.
For all of the condensing that was done, this easily could have been a very sort of low budget, kind of cheap shocker. I know Robert Florey's vision for this film, the original director, he wanted the monster to kind of be this raging monster without really a whole lot of nuance. And that's definitely one way I could see this movie going. And I think that's kind of how some of the sort of the middle group of these Universal monster movies go in terms of their monsters. They just sort of become plot devices rather than characters. And I think that this film really does a great job of threading the needle, of condensing the story down into the essential bits, and then also giving the monster a legitimate, nuanced personality. And I think that has a lot to do with Karloff and his direction from James Whale. They found the life inside this monster.
I think what it comes down to is the character is there. Like Frankenstein is there, the monster is there. Like by the end of this movie, they have arced, right? They have changed. They are different one way or the other, And there's a great moment sort of after Fritz is found dead where Henry's like, I regret this 100%, and has like a mental breakdown. And later when the creature actually learns the value of life, it's kind of amazing.
I could easily see this monster not working so well on the page. Again, I think sort of what I was trying to say before is that so much of it is in Karloff's performance that if you were to read the screenplay, he might not read as sympathetic as he really is. But Karloff just had such a command over his face and his expressions. Even through that makeup, he could still make us empathize with this character.
Whatever James Wales is doing to get this silent performance out of him in a sound film, right? Like, it's crazy that the creature grunts and groans once or twice, but for all intent and purpose, it's one of those throwback, I guess at the time it wouldn't be so much because we're just getting out of the silent era, but it is more of a silent performance with, a lot of sort of bigger gestures and stuff like that. But he's never going for like a cheap scare. Like there's a couple cuts that are jarring and shocking, but they're earned and sort of necessary. It's never just like, okay, now we're just going to cut to the monster to scare you. No, like that's not the purpose here.
Right. Yeah, I think that if he had not been made to look so monstrous, the film could play entirely differently. I think the strength of this film as a horror film has to do with the makeup, first of all. And then, yeah, some of that editing, because I don't think Karloff's playing this as a monster. He's playing this kind of as a 5-year-old, right? Like he's kind of got that 5-year-old mentality. And so if you were to strip all of that makeup off of him and just kind of sort of examine the character from an objective point of view, he's really not that scary. It's just, this movie is just so visual. And what it does, the makeup, of course, we've touched on many times. Arthur Edison's cinematography is great. And just the stark contrast with the lights and the shadows, I mean, that makes Karloff look more terrifying as well. So yeah, it's incredible. There's this combination of things that actually makes this a pretty intense horror film for the 1930s.
Yeah, and they really amped up and twisted the scenery and the backgrounds and all that kind of stuff as much as possible. And then, like, on a subconscious level, that really starts to get to you. Like, it really makes you feel uncomfortable and you don't know why. It's almost like subliminal kind of stuff. But it's a thing where it's like you weren't seeing like the twisted cells and the gigantic cast shadows in any other types of movies at the time in America. I'm sure, it was all these foreign movies, which again, I had to remind myself like, oh yeah, this was an American movie. Like it feels so Euro for the time. That was hard for me to sort of get a grip on. I was like, I can't believe that this is an American film.
Yeah. In hindsight, I'm just so glad that that's the direction they went in. Let's dive into the story itself. Of course, we touched on the intro from Edward Van Sloan, the sort of warning to the audience. And then we open the film proper in a cemetery. We had talked about the scene in Dracula with when the ship arrived to London and we only see the shadows of like the crew that had been murdered on the deck of the ship. And you had referenced EC Comics, right? And the sort of the way that they would show all of these grotesque scenes with a lot of shadow and silhouette and whatnot. This opening graveyard scene reminded me of that. Like you can't even believe it. Silhouettes of crosses and gravestones, and there's a Grim Reaper statue. Like this is EC to a T.
For an opening scene in a movie to take place at a nighttime funeral and then a grave robbing scene directly after that, like, this is crazy. Like, I was shocked. That's my word of the night. Like, I just can't believe, like, what a reaction this movie's been getting out of me. And then they're digging up the grave and he shovels some dirt right into the face of the Grim Reaper statue as if to, like, spit on death.
So yeah, of course, we've got this cemetery, and Frankenstein and Fritz are in there. As soon as this thing is covered up, they're in there with their shovels digging this corpse back up. And then we get to the next body. They cut down this body from like a gallows along a road, which of course, as I mentioned before, is a very medieval practice. I love it as an idea. Again, it's kind of funny how I never really thought about it until this time, that it was so out of time, right? Like, if this is supposed to be the 1930s, this would never have existed. So they get their second body. Of course, the brain is useless because the neck of that body is broken. So now they have to steal a brain or acquire a brain from somewhere else.
Let me just mention real quick that these two are thick as thieves. They are thieves. They're grave robbing thieves, but like they are like besties. Like, where did he find Fritz? Like, what? This guy Fritz is like a hunchback and deformed and all. Like, did he offer up like a foot to use during the procedure? Like, I know that there was a movie called Victor Frankenstein or something like that where like this relationship was explored. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, but like these two guys, they're trouble, man.
So yeah, no, I love their chemistry here. I think, at the time, the Depression, I imagine Frankenstein must have put out an ad for some help in the lab. Somebody capable. And Fritz is like, you want me to help you steal bodies? Sure, I can do that.
Yeah, he looked at his resume. He's like, I've stolen 8 bodies by now. Yeah.
Yeah, who knows how these two got together, but they do seem to work really well in the lab. Now we get to meet Dr. Waldman, played by Edward Van Sloan, and he's teaching a class about, brains. He has an average, perfect, healthy brain, and then, of course, he's got the dysfunctional, criminal, abnormal brain.
This is a fascinating class I want to take. He basically is like, this guy lived a life of purity. Like, he never robbed, stole, or cheated. It did everything he was supposed to. Look at his perfect pink brain. And he's like, this guy was like a murderer and a thief. And then he's like, look how deformed his brain is and everything. Like, this is just crazy science of the day. I sit back and look at this and go, like, movies teach you the worst things sometimes. Like, people left the theater going, there's a criminal brain and there's a regular brain and stuff. And like, it's so great for the purpose of this movie.
There's no scene like this in the novel or any of the plays. Like, this was added by John L. Balderston, when he was working on his version of the script, as a way to sort of sidestep all of the sort of complex issues between the creature being created and then, killing a bunch of people.
It feels like when that guy wrote that book about comic books, right? Like the corruption of the youth or something. And it's like, we need to cover our asses here. Like, we can't say that like the creature came from a nice thing. Like, it all has to be sort of twisted politically so that we don't influence the children improperly or anything like that.
Right. So yeah, this scene with the brains, or this whole detail about the brains, was an attempt to condense the story to the point where they could just explain the creature killing people and behaving the way he does without a whole lot of necessary explanation.
Do you need much more than like having come back from the dead to go on sort of like a mindless rampage? I love the scene. I think it's actually a very clever addition to this movie in particular. But yeah, it just seems like there's something more going on here where they just wanted to say something about society maybe, and about like the criminal and the do-gooder or something.
It does raise some interesting questions about, nature versus nurture, right? I think that's sort of a theme of this film as a result of that. But I mean, at the same time, from the moment this creature is born, he is living in fear. He's got torches in his face. He's being wrestled to the ground. He's being injected with needles. So who's to say that a perfectly normal brain would have made a difference?
Yeah, like he would have just woken up under the same circumstances anyway, and that could have been what drove him to his actions.
From a screenwriting perspective, that's what that scene was put in there for.
That's very smart.
I've seen versions of Frankenstein on stage, which really get into the sort of the themes of the novel, right, with an intelligent monster and all that. And, those are really cool too. But in this movie, I'm so grateful for that scene, because when I want to watch this movie, I don't want time for all that other stuff, right? I'm not looking for philosophy. I'm looking for a horror show, right? So I think this movie could serve that purpose, whereas the novel and those other sort of adaptations could serve those other purposes.
The juxtaposition between what's happening in the scene and how it's happening is brilliant. Like, it's a very disturbing scene of a guy sneaking in to steal this brain, and yet he's the clumsiest fuck in the world. He's tripping over chairs, he's dropping the other brain, like the skeleton's scaring the hell out of him. Like, it's a riot.
Oh, I love the addition of him pulling down on the skeleton, making it bounce. Total James Whale, just injecting a little bit of comedy into this otherwise really dark and horrifying sequence. But yeah, it's a pretty amazing scene. It's pretty iconic, especially now, and it's been parodied all to hell. Now we've got Fritz, who did his job very poorly. He's damaged the healthy brain, and so he had to steal the corrupt brain instead. And so now, after that scene, which I have to imagine was a little bit intense for 1930s audiences, we cut to a scene between Elizabeth and her friend Victor, who clearly is in love with her.
Oh yeah, this is the love triangle. We get the picture of Henry on like the piano, and so while Victor and Elizabeth are talking, they're like talking over the picture of Henry. So it's like this absentee guy who's like in the middle of this all, but she doesn't seem to really be digging him. Victor is so in love with this woman, like it's obvious to me, you know, he's in love with his best friend's girl. It's like, I just didn't think of that being the drama back in the day, but I guess so. I mean, there's not much going on with it. Like, they sort of team up after this scene and go talk to the doctor together, and then the three of them go to talk to Henry. So I guess it's cool that all of his friends come together and are caring for him and stuff. But I ultimately thought it was like, yeah, Victor wants her, but she doesn't really see him at all.
Right. Previous versions of this story, maybe in some of the play adaptations, Victor was engaged to Elizabeth at one point. So there was a romantic involvement. This could be sort of a holdover from that, but it definitely reads today as though he's sort of kind of stuck in that friend zone. This scene sort of serves as a cool down period after that intense scene with Fritz stealing the brain. And then they sort of discuss that Henry's been secluded and he's working on these experiments. And so, concerned for Henry, they go to visit Dr. Waldman to kind of get a better sense of what the hell he's doing up there all by himself. And that's when we kind of learn that he's sort of been outgrowing the class.
That's one way to put it.
His aspirations have grown beyond what he can learn in Dr. Waldman's class, right?
He sort of wants to go more in the direction of like mad science. Like Dr. Not Van Helsing was kind of like, you know, when he told me what he wanted to do, I just had to let him go. Like, you know, I just could not be part of... He's basically like, your friend is nuts, right? Like, he's trying to bring people back to life. I'm glad you came to me because we should all have like an intervention for this dude.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens. Even though he doesn't believe there's a whole lot he can really do, he does agree to go with Elizabeth and Victor to the watchtower up in the mountains where Frankenstein's lab is. So, of course, they all decide to go up on the night Frankenstein is about to hopefully succeed in his newest experiment. He's got this new body all stitched together. He's got the brain put in. All that's left to do is wait for the lightning to arrive. And, of course, right on cue, Elizabeth, Waldman, and Victor all show up, disturbing his experiment. I love that sequence where they're banging on the door, right? The rain's coming down, they're banging on the door. Fritz goes to see who it is, and he like sort of hobbles down the staircase. It's like this sort of subtle moment of physical comedy, which I really enjoy. Dwight Fry, man, I don't get enough of him.
There's that really natural moment where he like pulls his sock up.
Yeah.
This is when we get the first good look at the lab tower.
The lab, yep.
This is not like human geometry. Whoever built this fucking thing is from Lovecraft dimension or something, because from the outside it just bends and twists at impossible angles. Who would build something? And then on the inside it's totally warped beyond like recognition. Like it is supposed to reflect the internal mind frame of Dr. Frankenstein, and I think it does that perfectly.
The person who was responsible for designing this lab was a set designer and an electrical special effects creator named Kenneth Strickfaden. I don't know how much experience he had with movies at the time, but he was kind of like an electrician, and he had like all of this junk in his possession. And inspired by the laboratory sequences in Metropolis, he took all this stuff that he had and essentially designed that laboratory. All of those devices and instruments, all of that really was him just kind of like playing around with a bunch of crap that he had laying around. Isn't that crazy?
It's so jam-packed, and like every inch of it is just stuffed, and you got like the Tesla coils going off. And this is a sound movie, but there's there's really no music, right? And the music comes from electricity. Like, I wonder if David Lynch is getting a boner watching this, because you got the lightning striking with the thunder, and then you have all of the buzzing and the whizzing and the whirling of all the devices. And it's just like snapping and popping and humming. It's creating this, like, this is Frankenstein. This is what he hears, like, in his mind all the time. It just gets to you, like electricity does. Like, it gives you a static shock sometimes. It makes your hair sort of stand on edge. I get a very uneasy feeling from his lab. And it's the only time we're seeing technology in this entire movie. Like, there isn't a light bulb to be found anywhere else in this freaking thing.
That's true. It's one of those anachronistic things, or another one of those details that sets this outside of time, right? Is that there are no familiar modern inventions in this sequence, right? This is where they would all be. But all of these things look like they came out of a spaceship.
Like, not only did he hoard all these body pieces, but he took every piece of tech from the city too, and was like, I need this more than you.
Yeah. And so this lab it was just sort of put together, like I said, by like an electrician based on stuff he had laying around. This influenced every mad scientist lab for the rest of time. Isn't that incredible?
It's sort of tailored and altered to a more believable degree, and that, like, Metropolis was a sci-fi futuristic thing going on, robot lady and everything. This is much more believable, right? Like, Frankenstein, it's like he's talking to us. He seems very lucid, like he knows what's going on. So you're like, that man put together this contraption. He got that deep into his science that he sort of created an entire new level of scientist, the mad scientist.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think the performances in this are what really ground it, because, I mean, in this scene in particular, it's almost like this Watchtower lab is set in a different universe than the town below, right? Because the set design is all very different. You know, there's a lot of diagonal angles. There's no straight walls here. There's a lot of heavy contrast. This one set, more than anything else in this film, I feel like is the best example of German Expressionism. But unlike German Expressionism, you've got these performances that do feel real. So when you watch a movie like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or you watch Metropolis, now these are silent films. They don't have the luxury of having sound. We can't hear these actors performing these monologues and whatnot, but they perform in a very over-the-top way, you know, in a very theatrical, very stagey way. Here, we get moments of that. I mean, when Frankenstein's experiment works and it's alive, and, you know, like, that's very over-the-top. But I mean, for the most part, we get these performances that feel very grounded in reality, even when the set looks like a set.
A couple interesting points there. The contrast between his lab and the rest of this country, you know, when we cut back even to his palatial estate with his father, like, there's very floral and ornate patterns everywhere, and it feels very earthy.
And very busy and very real, too.
Yeah, and then, like, the town is full of life and jovial and, like, a lot more sort of curved edges everywhere, I would say, as opposed to, like, the jaggedness and all that kind of stuff. That works really well. And then also the contrast, like you're saying, like, between the acting and the sets. Like, typically in a very highly expressionistic film, and I would even imagine before this, a couple of the sound films that tried to do this, like, yeah, the acting would also match that. Like, the acting would be very over the top or something. And here they're not. Like, James Whale is sort of saying, like, okay, just act like you're in a melodrama, but we're going to stage it like we're in a horror film. He knew how to give and take and what to balance when.
I point out this particular scene just because of how much that set is so absurd. It's not a realistic laboratory. Like, everything about it is very cartoonish by today's standards, but I don't lose track of the fact that these performances seem very real. I know Fritz, being sort of the hunchback assistant, is a little more colorful than the rest, but, you know, again, for the most part, these performances feel real.
It's interesting about Fritz, about how he's sort of the precursor to be like, get used to Fritz, because, like, it's gonna get crazier than Fritz. He might be weird and looking and shit, but, like, we got the monster coming, so, like, it almost seems like they're sort of preparing you a little bit for that or something.
Yeah, maybe.
The other thing I think was really interesting about Fritz is that, like, everyone just sort of accepts him. Everyone else doesn't seem anything wrong with this guy being around. It's just like, oh yeah, that's Fritz, like, that's his helper guy, whatever, like, we're cool with him.
Yeah, no one thinks twice about Fritz. But okay, so Elizabeth and Victor and Dr. Waldman are all there, of course, interrupting the experiment. But in this moment of almost defiant pride, Frankenstein's like, I'll show you. He decides to go ahead with his experiment. And of course, he raises the table up to the top of the tower during the thunderstorm. The lightning does its thing. And as he brings that table back down, the hand, in maybe the most famous sequence in this whole film, the hand starts to move and it is alive.
It's so good that he has an audience for this.
Yes.
Like proof, like it's happening. I've got corroborators over there. What a great touch.
And I think that gives him a little more license to be as fanatical as he is, because he's literally talking to other people who disbelieved him, right?
And he's showboating too. Who wouldn't sort of rub it in a little bit? No one ever believed me, and I was right, and now I'm going to gloat in your face.
Now, one of the things I find interesting about this particular scene, I mentioned that a couple of the scenes in this movie were censored or cut out altogether because of some controversial material in them. One of them is in this sequence. After shouting, "It's alive," I think like 7 times, Frankenstein says, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." That was a line that was cut out because of the way it offended certain religious groups. You know, the suggestion that someone could know what it was like to be God just rubbed people the wrong way. And so that line was cut out and wasn't put back until, I think, the 1990s.
It was a long time, because I think it was around re-release after the Hays Code that all the edits were made, and then it took a while to find a print that was still intact after they all got chopped to bits. But I mean, look, even today, well, we have the MPAA, which really blows, but thankfully there isn't like a religious overlord looking at the movies that these days. Like, this is some crazy shit. Like, that's what they would do back in the day. They just fucking every little thing that didn't relate to like God or the Bible or this was like blasphemous, you know, and it had to go. It's just kind of like a darkness, like a dark stain on like the art society, like even to today.
Frankenstein is a pre-code film. However, it was also produced by a major studio who wanted this to be seen by the largest possible audience. So while they could have gone ahead with that scene and the other scenes that were cut out, it would have severely impacted their return on that investment. So just because there wasn't an organization in place to censor that material doesn't mean that stuff like that didn't get cut out. I think that's important to note.
Yeah, that could come down from like the studio head who had a certain way of belief as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it came from Universal, I have to believe that these decisions were made by Universal, not because of somebody else. You know, they wanted to make as much money as they could with this film. So I have to believe they were just looking out for their own interests. Of course, in a few years, when the Hays Code went into effect, that's when you start getting into the actual organizations and, you know, eventually the development of the MPAA, which would have an authority to say this can be in a movie, this can't be in a movie, or if you're going to put this in a movie, it's got to be rated whatever. That wasn't a thing yet.
Right. It won't be for a while, but the most famous scene of the movie, to my understanding, will be cut at some point and lost for a long period of time.
The line about knowing what it feels like to be God, I looked up my notes. That was put back into the film with the first DVD release. So that line stayed out of the movie for a long time. The VHS copy that I had as a kid must not have had that line in there. I don't remember, and I don't even know if I still have that VHS copy. If my notes are accurate, then yeah, it wasn't in the version I watched as a kid. And to think that that scene was kept out of the movie from 1931 until its first DVD release, that's a crazy long time.
Censorship is just never good. You know, that's my final word, I guess, on that.
Okay, so with the experiment a success, we have a scene with Elizabeth and Baron Frankenstein and Victor as well. They're all kind of discussing some more of what Frankenstein has been up to up in the tower. They're discussing his experiment. I mean, this is more of James Whale bringing us back down after a pretty intense scene.
Yeah, we get the Burgermeister shows up, that poor prick.
We understand that Baron Frankenstein is preparing for his son's wedding, which is coming up, and the whole town is going to be involved in that.
I love characters that I hate because it means they work so well, right? Like,
Yes.
That's such a compliment to James Wales for him to be able to put a guy like this on screen and me to feel like, man, I'm glad this guy wasn't my dad.
But he just seems to be having so much fun in this scene. I mean, I don't know really much about this actor at all outside of this film, but he seems to have a real knack for comedy, and I just love the way he hams it up in this scene. And it's such a great contrast to the scene before it. I think James Whale was really smart to put a scene like this right after the reanimation of the monster.
It's almost almost like tit for tat, scene to scene like that. Not exactly, but like almost where it's like after we've gotten 2 or 3 kind of intense moments, like we're going to deflate again for a minute.
Exactly. After that scene, we get a scene of Dr. Frankenstein speaking with Dr. Waldman. And this is maybe the most sane we ever get to see Frankenstein. Like, this is maybe the most sober we see him. I learned that this scene was added after the shooting script was completed. This was something supposedly that James Whale had insisted on doing kind of on the spot with the intention of making Henry seem more sympathetic, more sane. This particular Frankenstein is not a monster, though there are other adaptations, other versions. Certainly the Hammer horror Dr. Frankenstein is insane and evil. But James Whale wanted the audience to be able to sympathize with this character. So he put in this scene where he's sort of explaining his whole thought process, what, his goals were. He even asked Waldman at one point, like, haven't you ever, wanted to reach into the unknown and do something that had never been done before? Like that was his whole motivation. He had nothing evil in his intentions, right? So I think it's a really great scene between Colin Clive and Edward Van Sloan.
Yeah, I'm really glad it's here because it shows that Frankenstein isn't a psychopath. He's under control, like he's calm, he's cool, like he seems to be so aware of what's going on in this moment. You can't say that he has lost it. You know what I'm saying? Like if anything, he seems very gratified that he was able to prove himself right. He's not like, I'm going to go any further, right? He's like, I've done what I'm going to do, and now let's take it from there. And then let's run some experiments on this thing. Let's see where it goes. And if I'm not mistaken, the other doctor's like, we have to kill this thing immediately. What you have done is an abomination. And Henry's just like, relax, man. Like, this is science. Like, we're on the cutting edge. Let's just enjoy the moment. I like that because it just shows that he's not out of control like you think he is, because in the previous scene, he was stark raving mad, but like, that was just like a lapse. Even throughout the rest of the movie, I mean, he will sort of have like a panic attack at one point, but other than that, like, he never really gets up the fervor or the mania ever again.
Right. Like he learns in that scene that the brain that he put into that creature was the abnormal criminal brain.
Doesn't he say to that effect, well, that doesn't really matter?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. So like, I love that, how it's almost like that was such a big deal. And yet he's like, when he finds out, he's like, he kind of like bites his finger for a second. And he's like, that shouldn't really be too big a deal. I think we could work around that.
But we know it's a big deal. So, and then of course that scene is a great sort of precursor to the reveal of the monster finally. We hear him sort of stomping into the next room, and the door swings open, and he walks in backwards in the shadow, and then as he turns, we get that incredible shot of his face. There's like jump cuts as we zoom closer and closer in on his face.
Yeah, I think this is the only time I like jump cuts. You get them from time to time in sort of like more artistic films, I guess, or otherwise they're seen as like mistakes in modern movies and things, but this was amazing. Like, what a technique to just be like, closer, no closer, no closer. Just like, you don't have time to sort of process what you're seeing, and then you're right in front of the thing.
In these early films, like in silent films, jump cuts were a lot more common too. So it's a little bit jarring today for sure, but you got to remember at the time, jump cuts happened all the time, and especially in the scene when they cut out that, I know what it feels like to be God line. The only way to get that out of the movie was a jump cut, so that they just sort of cut that piece out and then just spliced it back together. So yeah, I don't think that a jump cut was necessarily as sloppy as it seems today.
Yes, but it's nice to see it. This is intentional. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
like, this isn't
yes,
because
yes.
we're missing some frames because of the damaged reel or anything like that. Like, he probably, James Wales, that is, maybe his process was, there are a lot of jump cuts just naturally in films because the technology is just shitty still, right? Like, so like, maybe he kind of subconsciously was like, did that intentionally to make it feel like, kind of like nowadays with Grindhouse, how you add in all the damage and stuff. Maybe he was like, if I do this in jump cuts, like, it'll give more of a visceral effect, because when that happens, when you're watching a normal movie, you sort of get like a reaction out of it. And even though it's unintentional, then I'm gonna make it intentional.
The effect I get from this particular scene is I'm being sort of thrust forward towards a monster that is terrifying against my will. That's, I think, what they were going for with those jump cuts.
What I got from it is like, you just can't get away from this thing.
I definitely felt like I was being pushed closer to him against my will. Which, either way, it definitely worked because audiences were terrified of this thing.
I could just hear the screams in the audience in the 30s. As he's turning around, they probably started, and then they just got like the entire theater was probably just like losing their mind.
Oh, for sure. But then we get some like a really gentle sequence for a little bit. They have him, sitting down, and at one point Frankenstein opens up that sort of shade on the ceiling to let the sunlight in, and the monster reaches up in a very sort of childlike way. And then of course Fritz shows up with a torch and just fucks the whole thing up. And then from that point on, the monster is just terrified of everything. They have to wrestle him to the ground and knock him out with a tranquilizer. And of course he wakes up after that chained in a dungeon.
And he hates Fritz specifically because, like, he's the fire bringer, like, he remembers him most because that was, like, his first experience with fear and pain. Henry and the doc, they're doing these tests. They're just, like, taking him for a test drive. They're like, sit up, sit down, stand on one leg. Like, it's going really slow. And then in comes Fritz with the fire. And, like, come on, like, is there anything more dangerous right now for any of them than fire, like what that represents? And I mean, it's interesting that this is also the modern Prometheus who stole the fire from the gods to give to the humans and stuff. And here, fire is not the one weakness, but maybe like the main kryptonite of the modern Prometheus. So there's like a nice irony to that too.
Yeah, and I read somewhere that in an early version of the screenplay, Frankenstein was written as a much more cruel character. He was going to sort of embody all of these sorts of things. I guess when Fritz was originally brought into the script, all of those antagonistic qualities were taken from Frankenstein and given to Fritz, which I thought was a great move. I could see in a bigger movie, if we had, like 2 to 3 hours to tell this story, having Frankenstein be a more nuanced character who has moments of intense aggression, but then also moments where we can sympathize, like there's definitely something to that idea. But since we only have an hour and 10 minutes, I think it was brilliant to split that part of him into a completely separate character. Because like Fritz is not necessary. He's there, as an assistant. He's necessary for this particular sequence where he kind of starts this creature's life with a lot of antagonism and aggression, right? Like that sets the tone for the rest of his existence. I love that elements of Frankenstein were given to Fritz because it makes Fritz a more interesting character. Because he's can be funny and he's helpful around the lab, but then like we also learn as soon as this monster is created, we kind of see a darker side to him. Fritz is kind of a dickhead.
Oh, well, he's number 2 now. Like, Frankenstein has a new freak to play with. Like, Fritz is being sidelined. Like, that's kind of one way I put it. Or at least there's some kind of weird jealousy going on between the new dog and the old dog. And I'm glad we don't get Henry whipping the creature. I like it more that it's Fritz going wild on him.
Right.
And those two things sort of taking care of themselves. Like, that the creature kills Fritz instead of whatever else they had in mind. Like, what would happen if Dr. Frankenstein was whipping this creature? I mean, the only logical step was he'd die way too early in the movie. That's how I see it.
Not necessarily. So there were a bunch of different endings, but because Frankenstein was supposed to live and have a happy ending, they decided not to have him be sort of a monster to his creation. Because there were other endings where they would have both died. There was another ending, I think, somewhere where the monster like just flung himself off of a cliff and committed suicide. But I think that because Universal wanted a sort of happy ending, at least for Henry Frankenstein, they had to make him completely sympathetic. If Frankenstein was a malicious piece of shit to his creation, which, again, there are versions of that story, then they both have to die. Frankenstein can't be an asshole and live.
Right, like this version can't even kill his own creation, Like once he sees that the monster killed Fritz, he's like, yeah, like I regret this. Like this was a bad call. Like it's killed my friend. What do I do? Like he's a coward. Like he doesn't even have the balls to kill it himself, right? He asks not Van Helsing to do it. Sorry, I'm just gonna keep calling him not Van Helsing. Just Dr. Waldman. I don't want to see him standing over the creature while it's sleeping with a giant mallet, right? Waiting to rain down blows upon it or anything. Like it's so much more human that he would feel this way, that he would be sort of this roller coaster of emotions. I love the complexity of Frankenstein, and for him to be just straight out evil or a bad guy, like that just cheapens it so much. Like the idea of him is he is a monster because he's a person. Like there's not much more to it than that.
This particular version of Henry Frankenstein or Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist of this story, I like how sympathetic he is here, and I like he's not the strongest character. Like I said, there's been other versions where he's been more dominant in the story. I like this version because it's stuff like this that makes this particular adaptation sort of transcend horror for me. It makes it a more complicated or more nuanced drama, as opposed to just straight up horror show.
Yeah, absolutely. I've much more picked up on that this screening because I think previously I was just looking at it as a horror film. Granted, this is like a monster podcast and everything, but I was trying to see if there was anything more to it. And like, I might even say, sure, this is a monster movie. This is more of like a sci-fi film than like a horror film because of all of that drama stuff. Like that just inherently feels like the kind of thing you get in sci-fi, especially like hard sci-fi kind of stuff when you're dealing with, I don't know, like creating a person out of nothing kind of thing. Just like the mental sort of tangents you can go on with those kinds of things, as opposed to horror, which is generally, and not always, but mostly until recently with like elevated horror and stuff, which this feels closer to, it's not that deep. And there's nothing wrong with that. And some of it is deep, but for the most part, it's very sort of surface. And I feel like this is much deeper than I used to give it credit for.
For sure. And I think because of the way they've written these characters, this might be the only, or one of the few films in the Universal Monsters series where there's not really a true villain. There's a monster by definition.
Because at first you for sure think that like Henry's a villain, and then it turns out that he's kind of not. And then you think the monster's a villain, but it's also kind of not. The Baron is probably the meanest guy in this whole movie.
By the end of the film, you have a confrontation between the Frankenstein and his monster. But I mean, if I'm being honest, when I watch this, I don't have a side that I'm on, right? Like these are two characters that I have sympathized with over the course of this film, and I feel deeply for both of them. But they both have been victimized on some level. The monster has been treated the way he's been treated because of the way he looks, and has, just by learning how to be a person, has committed some pretty horrible acts. But like at the end of the day, we understand that he's not consciously making these choices, and Frankenstein is only just now starting to grapple with the consequences of his own actions. So really, I don't see a villain in this movie, even though there is a monster, you know what I mean? And I think that's what's so good about this.
Yeah, I see them as two sides to the same coin. Like by the end, when we're in the windmill, like he's looking into a mirror, and it just comes down to excising that side of yourself. It's more about like letting that part of you die. Like it's a symbolic thing for me by the end of all of this. But I'm rooting for Frankenstein and the creature because by the end of it, they both sort of learn what it means to be human. And what that means is to sort of understand that you are capable of horrible atrocities and that you will then take responsibility for those. Like that's how it kind of comes through in the wash for me, is that both of these characters have that realization. I'm not a monster. I'm a person, and people are inherently sort of like this. I'm like this because I'm human. And by the end, the creature is just as much human as the rest of us. Like we're chasing him with a pitchfork. Like it could be you or me.
We kind of sort of covered some of what happens next here. Fritz antagonizes the creature to the point where the monster kills him. And I gotta be honest, when I was a kid, we don't see Fritz die. We just hear his scream through the halls, right? That scream, that performance from Dwight Frye chilled me to my bones when I was a kid. I never found this movie to be all that scary, even as a kid, but that scream always got to me. And to this day, like I still like kind of feel a little bit of that as an adult.
It's interesting how, in Dracula, we got like all the accents and all the colorful language and all that kind of stuff in that to sort of replace all the music that isn't there. And here it's sort of the same thing, but it's all like screaming and yelling and like blood curdling screams and stuff like that. Like it's sort of like the chorus of the macabre or something. We get the music in the town square for a minute, but that's all like diegetic. Like that's in the scene. That's not like on the soundtrack or anything like that. Like if you were just to listen to the soundtrack of this, it's just like electrical sounds and screaming. And like that's the music of this movie.
Now with Fritz dead and Frankenstein kind of coming to the realization that his experiment has been a huge mistake. He and Waldman conspire to sedate the monster and keep it locked away. As Henry collapses from his exhaustion, he decides to head back home with Elizabeth. But before he goes, Waldman assures him that he will destroy the monster.
That's so great how Henry passes out. I don't know. I saw it as like a panic attack or an anxiety attack
for
or
sure.
something like that, you know? And then everyone's like, oh, let's get him back home. Let's get him back home. And so it's so cool that like from now on, he thinks like he's in the clear. Like he doesn't know that in the next scene where the doctor's sort of like examining the creature's gonna kill the doctor and escape into like the countryside and stuff. Like I love the idea, you know, just in movies in general where like the audience knows more than one of the main characters, you know, there's just so much tension at that point where I'm like, he's out there somewhere. Like you can shut the door and close your eyes, but he's still coming for you.
Yeah, and I love that scene, the sequence with Waldman and the creature, because audiences knew this actor as Van Helsing, vampire killer. And here he is halfway through this movie getting killed by the creature. So now, like, all bets are off. Whatever safety we may have felt as an audience having Edward Van Sloan in this movie, it's gone. Van Helsing is now dead, and the monster's on the loose. I don't know if that was done intentionally, casting Edward Van Sloan in this role for that reason, but I love that's how it worked out, because that was the first thing I saw, like, or thought of when I watched that scene. I thought, oh shit.
I love that. Like I didn't consider that, but like that makes perfect sense. Even I was calling him Van Helsing watching the movie, and I was like, yeah, he's gonna fuck shit up, you know, like he's a monster hunter, but like he can't kill no Frankenstein monster, that's for sure. Like I'm sure he could take on a werewolf or a mummy at one day, but like this is out of his league. I wish we could see his face, and I wish it was Van Helsing, because he would have this look in his eye like, I've overstepped my bounds. Like
right. So once the monster kills Waldman and escapes into the countryside, Henry's at home preparing for his wedding. As the wedding day arrives, we meet a young farmer's daughter, Maria, who is just playing outside. Her dad goes off to get some work done, and the monster appears. And what we think is going to be a horrifying moment for this little girl is actually quite the opposite. She is not afraid of him at all, and invites him to come play with her by the lake there. It's such a beautiful scene, and him playing with this girl, and they're throwing the flowers into the lake. So this scene was one of the scenes that was censored upon release. I love this moment with the monster, you know, finally meeting somebody who wasn't afraid of him. And of course, he ruins it by throwing the girl into the lake, thinking she'll float like the flowers. Karloff himself thought this scene was a little too extreme. He didn't care for it. He wanted to like have the monster place her in the water and have her drown. He thought chucking her into the lake was too aggressive. The crew on the film thought that was a little too heavy. And James Whale himself disagreed with everybody and said, quote, "It's all part of the ritual," whatever that means. When the movie came out, audiences and the studio also disagreed with James Whale. That scene was cut, and like the part that was cut is, so the scene plays out, and as the monster goes to reach for Maria, the film cuts, and it goes back to, I think, Frankenstein's home as they're getting ready for the wedding. So we don't get to see what happens to Maria. You know, what happens is he chucks her into the water and she drowns. But I think cutting that scene out, now you may disagree, you may agree, I think cutting out the scene leaves far too much to the imagination and is almost worse than having that scene play out.
This is probably one of the greatest scenes in film history.
Yes.
Especially within the context of this story, it is like masterful. I understand where audiences were coming from, but this is what makes James Whale's like a genius. This is way too extreme. Like this is very cruel. This is super over the top. Like even for today, there's sort of like not a golden rule, but you don't see kids get killed on screen a lot, you know? Like it just doesn't happen. And like Michael Myers looks past the trick-or-treaters, right? To the teenager babysitters, right? I don't know how the hell they got away with this in the first place, but I think what he means by it's part of the ritual is just that, is that you have to create a reaction. You have to sort of push the limits and ideas of where people are comfortable with. And like, if we're making a horror movie, this is a step in the right direction. Like this is a character development step. Without this, Frankenstein he'll never learn, you know, like right. And he'll especially never understand the value of human human life. And this is just like played out so beautifully. You know something bad is going to happen, and it plays it the exact opposite up until the very moment. And then it's just long enough where like you're like, did he really just drown that kid? And then you see the look on his face. He knows exactly what he did the minute he did it. It's like this double sort of shock of like, oh my God, I'm horrified. And then like, oh my God, like I can't believe how much I sort of sympathize for the creature, because he knows what he did. Like he understands that was the bad thing to do. It is hard to comprehend sometimes while I'm watching it, like that they actually pulled this off and got away with it. But it is like brilliant. The tact and the way that this sequence has been constructed is just amazing.
I agree with you 100% on this scene. I think this may be one of the best scenes in the whole movie. Aside from the experiment scene with the monster coming to life, aside from that, this is maybe the other best scene in the film.
Nature is so against this creature. Like fire burns him, the water has cursed him, right? Like he just does not fit in to nature. Like he is like I think that's what hammered it home most for me, is like he is an abomination. You know what I'm saying? Like he's not supposed to be here. He's like a glitch in the Matrix or something. Like with him on our planet, like only these bad things can happen.
Right. I think just the way the Karloff plays that, so it's so wonderful. You know, the moment he realizes what he's done, and he's just like, it's like you see that expression on kids' faces. The second they do something, they realize, oh shit, I made a huge mistake.
Dude, that look on his face is probably like the most haunting expression he gives throughout the entire movie. And it's one that he's afraid. It's his fear.
Yeah, and I think Karloff has a lot to do with the fact that even though the creature has done something that is unforgivable, we still can sympathize with him. There's so many moments in this movie that I think if handled in a different way by a different actor could have been played, like this monster could have just been a brute, been emotionless. But I think that, again, this is another example of Karloff really just knocking it out of the park. We've got Henry and Elizabeth preparing for their wedding day. And Victor rushes in with the news that Dr. Waldman has been found strangled and that the monster is nowhere to be found. So he is on the loose out in the countryside. And so that sort of sends up the whole wedding, right? Now we've got this monster we have to deal with before we can get married. And there's a great scene here where they hear the monster, right? They can hear it kind of like in the home. The monster found Frankenstein's house. I have no idea. Like this is one of those sort of logical leaps we have to make because of all the condensing going on. But either way, the monster is nearby, and so Frankenstein and his groomsmen all take the different parts of the house to try and find the monster. And they secure Elizabeth in her bedroom. And while she is in that room alone, the monster sneaks in through a window and assaults her. Now, there are different versions of this scene that play out in different adaptations. In this particular version, it doesn't seem that the monster does really a whole lot more than kind of frighten her. But there are versions of the story where he kills Elizabeth. There is a stage version that I've seen where the monster rapes Elizabeth. But that's a version where the monster is more intelligent and more vengeful toward his maker. So those motivations are different. But in this version, the monster is much more childlike, is more afraid than vengeful. We don't get to see what happens. We hear Elizabeth scream, and when everyone rushes into the bedroom, the monster's gone and she's sort of strewn across the bed. And so she doesn't appear to be any more worse for wear, but some assault of some kind has taken place.
So like I was thinking about it, like sure, maybe this was just like a random house that the monster just checked out, just happened to be Frankenstein's house. But I almost feel like there's like a connection. Like he can maybe I like to think that like he can almost sense, they can like sense each other or something like that. I don't think it's in the movie at all by any means, but I'm just trying to fill in some gaps in my own head as to like, oh yeah, like why does the creature know where Frankenstein lives? Also maybe it's just like the biggest house in the town, so he was just like drawn there too. Like that could be. That doesn't bug me. It doesn't bug me to find out how the little girl's father just like knows Frankenstein killed her, you know, the monster. How the little girl's father knows she was murdered as opposed to just sort of like fell in the lake kind of stuff. You know, like these leaps in logic, they don't bother me.
For sure. I'm right there with you. And you bring us to the next part where Maria's father arrives with her limp body. She, of course, drowned in the water, and he claims that she's been murdered. And of course, in maybe it's not the first. We established in Phantom of the Opera that the mob of people is not unique to this.
With pitchforks and torches. Yep.
They immediately create this like angry mob. I mean, they've been drinking beer all day, and even the Baron makes a joke at some point.
They were in the mood for a wedding, and now there's a murderer running around. I just gotta say, that tracking shot of the father holding the daughter, again, like, it seared into my brain. Like, I almost started to cry. The look on his face and the way that she's limp, talk about naturalistic, right? Like, it just feels like he's holding a dead kid, like, body, and as he's walking through town, everybody stops playing and looks at him and everything, and then he, like, walks right up to basically the police station, and he's like, grab your pitchforks, like, get your torches, like, what did James Whale say to that guy to get that look on his face?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the better shots in the film. So I've seen this a bunch of times, right? And I love watching the extras in the background as they're like partying and drinking, and they all have this moment where they notice what has just walked by. Yeah, man, they form that mob so quickly. Like, they're ready for blood. And I was going to say that the Baron makes a comment earlier on the wedding day, I think before they all toast to House Frankenstein. He mentions they've all been drinking beer and will probably get into, fights later in the day.
Yeah, he's like, right? He's like, let's waste the champagne on the maids and stuff, right? Like, everybody is getting loaded and celebrating, and he's like, oh, if I could count the number of bottles of beer they've been drinking today. But it's like an Oktoberfest going on. You're right. Like, they're slap dancing, they're doing the whole nine.
So, yeah, they're ready to hunt this creature down.
Yeah, the only thing worse than an angry mob is a drunken angry mob.
Oh, totally. Yeah, so the first of the Frankenstein angry mobs forms in this, because I think there's an angry mob in all of them.
That's something I know, like, The Simpsons really picked up on. The town of Springfield just always just resorts to an angry mob, if anything.
Yeah, I think there's an angry mob in every Frankenstein movie. It's like this town, they must have stores where they just sell torches and pitchforks. So they all form a couple different search parties. They form one led by Maria's father, one led by Henry Frankenstein, and one led by their burgomaster. Maria's father, Ludwig, is going to take them into the woods. Henry's going to take them into the mountains, and the burgomaster is going to lead his group by the lake. And of course, all three groups, they separate, and then they all come back together up in the mountains where Frankenstein himself encounters his monster. Now, this might be my favorite singular shot of the whole movie. I know it was printed onto a lobby card in color. To me, this is like what this movie has been building towards. We talked last episode about Van Helsing versus Dracula, the scenes they shared together and the intensity that was between them. When Frankenstein meets his monster up in the hills, there's like a moment where they don't say anything. I mean, they don't communicate. The monster can't speak. But like there's this moment where they just kind of stand there and acknowledge one another. Henry's got his torch, the monster's just standing there, and then they go for each other, and it becomes a battle at that point.
It's a showdown.
Yes.
It's like a Western almost. Like, they're looking at each other, they're kind of taking a moment, they're paced apart like 10 spaces even, and they're just waiting on the other one to make a move. It's so great. Here he is on top of the world, right? Like a god. With his creation. So it's like a very religious, I get a very sort of religious imagery from that shot that you're talking about specifically, where it's like creator, creation, on top of the world. You just see like the clouds and everything, and it's just them together. He's even holding the fire as if like I stole the fire from the gods kind of thing. It's like such a great shot.
I love what happens next, where the monster carries Frankenstein, manages to subdue him, and carries him up to this windmill. Now, one thing I didn't know about this film is that Boris Karloff did not use a stunt double for this film or for Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, I knew we were going to get the stunts eventually.
Yes. So when we get to this sequence where the monster is carrying the limp body of Henry Frankenstein up to this windmill and then up the stairs, up to the top of this thing, that's all Karloff. Karloff had to like carry the weight of Colin Clive up the hill, up into that windmill, and supposedly suffered from back problems for the rest of his life because of that.
Yeah, he had to do it in makeup, in those clunky boots, with that extra padding, and it's not like they even had Colin Clive on like a wench or anything to pull him, or a rope, like it was all dead weight.
Oh yeah, and they couldn't green screen out any cables or anything, they had to do it all for real. I was surprised they didn't have a stunt double.
I know, because because like all the makeup and stuff, you could so easily hide it. And like we're even gonna get a double for Colin Clive in the epilogue, out of focus. Yeah, it's weird.
Colin Clive gets 2 stunt doubles if you include the dummy that gets thrown onto the windmill.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to, every episode I want to get to stunts at some point. And, we had the carriage in Phantom. We had the fall from the very high stairwell in Dracula. And here we get a lot. Like we even had the little girl falling into the lake was a stunt.
Sure.
This, like a guy carrying another guy shot after shot, like that's a stunt for sure. And all this fucking fire at the end, man. All this fire at the end. Like I'm so worried for everybody on set with all this fire, dude. It is insane. How did they do that?
I love this whole sequence. And you're right. There's a lot going on, and a lot of it seems really dangerous. I mean, of course, when Frankenstein is thrown off the windmill and he lands on one of the blades of the windmill, you can tell that it's a dummy. But like, I don't know how they managed to do all the stuff with the fire. Like to do it with Karloff and not a stunt double is exceptional.
The dummy's a little unfortunate only because Frankenstein's supposed to survive. Like if he died like he was supposed to, that would have been a glorious death for him. Just so awkward and painful looking to be sort of clipped by a windmill that way. From what I understand is they kind of knew what they had. They knew that this movie was something else and they wanted to make a sequel. So that's what I thought. Like the idea was to film it the way that they had intended, and then at the end to just be like, no, he's okay. Like, don't worry about it. He'll be back.
It feels very much like they wanted to prepare for multiple possibilities. If this movie was a hit, then they could make a sequel. Like they could have Henry Frankenstein die in that final sequence. But then, yeah, of course, we have the final scene. The monster is trapped in the burning windmill, presumed dead, and then Henry's been tossed off the windmill, also presumed dead. We get this epilogue at House Frankenstein. We see Henry. It's not actually Colin Clive, as you mentioned. It is a double who's resting. He's in bed recovering from his injuries. Meanwhile, his father, the Baron, is having a small, lighthearted conversation with the maids of the home. And like that's how it ends. I think it's a great ending.
Part of me just wished it ended with the burning windmill thing, but I have to just think back to the way this movie's been balanced, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, there's no way they're going out on a downer. They're going to leave them laughing. It's like, you just saw Frankenstein, but if you stay till the end, you're going to have a smile on your face because the Baron's going to tell one last joke, all the maids are going to giggle, and we're going to go out on like a swell of fanfare. It was a terrible ordeal we all just went through, but everyone's okay. We'll be back, It's kind of brilliant in a marketing way where they had their cake and ate it too, where it's like, all right, we made our movie, but like, let's just add this little tag, just to sort of cover our bases.
Yeah, and I don't know if The Bride of Frankenstein was immediately thought of, that if the plan when this came out was to immediately jump into that, or if they decided to do that after it came out and became a huge hit. Like, I'm excited to discover that when we get to Bride. But this thing was a monster hit. It just became a phenomenon. It's insane. It opened in New York in December 1931 and grossed $53,000 in 1 week. I looked it up, or at least what this website is telling me. According to this website that calculates inflation, $53,000, which is what Frankenstein made in its first week, would be roughly $907,000 today. So imagine a movie making over $900,000 in a single week. That's huge. Frankenstein just destroyed the box office when it came out. And of course would go on to spawn multiple sequels, which we will get to. But yeah, I think it's going to wrap us up for this episode.
I'm very excited that James Whale comes back to direct The Bride of Frankenstein. I don't know that we get many repeat directors in the Universal monster movies that we're doing, but we'll see when we get there. But it seems to be like we have this winning formula, let's not screw it up. Let's get the whole team back together and try and duplicate the magic. From what I remember, I mentioned again in that sort of preview episode we did, Bride of Frankenstein, before going back into these, was my favorite. So I'm very very much looking forward to getting there.
Yeah, it seems very much in these early films. Maybe it only seems like that today, and maybe it wasn't so much the case then. James Whale had only made a couple of films before this, but it almost feels like they're hiring auteurs for these early films. You know, like, again, I don't know that that was necessarily the thinking at the time, but today we look at Todd Browning, we look at James Whale, we look at Karl Freund, who directed The Mummy. You know, James Whale comes back again for The Invisible Man and for Bride of Frankenstein. Like, we think of them as auteurs now and that they had distinct styles and whatnot, but maybe it wasn't then. But yeah, certainly it feels like that once they got through these first couple movies, Universal figured out what the formula was. The Laemmles were ousted from the studio, and then they just started cranking out these sort of B, C level creature features, which, you know, we'll get into all that when we get to them. But yeah, I think that's what I love so much about this like early handful of movies, because they're made by guys who had legitimate talent, whether that was by accident or by design. It's true today.
Yeah, I will subscribe to that auteur theory. I mean, even because if you look at Dracula and Frankenstein, Todd Browning and James Whales have very different styles, you know?
Yes.
Like we were sort of mentioning earlier, like Browning is way more sort of naturalistic and Whales seems to be, you know, much more expressionistic. And I'm sure they could each do both or whatever, but I love how it's sort of calculable. Like you could tell, like you could see their styles come through in these projects and stuff. And I think that does make it part of like the auteur system. And I think that's a good label.
Before we go, one thing I did learn about this film that having to do with Kenneth Strickfaden is that, you know, so he designed the whole lab and actually like operated a lot of the, electronics for that scene. The thing I learned about Kenneth Strickfaden is that Mel Brooks hired him also to operate the exact same lab machines for Young Frankenstein.
Excellent. Yeah, that's awesome.
Next time you're watching Young Frankenstein, you can know that it's the same guy who's flipping all those switches and making all that stuff come to life.
I hope this show lasts long enough that we could do like a comedy run where we do that and like Dracula Dead and Loving It, and we find like whatever the funny Wolfman movie was. I guess Teen Wolf. I don't know.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that because I feel like anybody listening to this is probably a huge fan of Young Frankenstein and would appreciate knowing that.
I love that. And Young Frankenstein, and like now that I've just rewatched regular Frankenstein, that feels like such a more of like a companion piece to this, you know, like even though it's a comedy, like it just feels like it was made around the same time with the same kind of sensibilities. I love it so much.
Yeah, me too. Okay, I think that's about it. I think we got just about everything we need. And with that, it's time for us to head back to our lab. We'll return on Friday, January 29th to ring in the new year with Karloff the Uncanny in Universal's 1932 production of The Mummy.
Nice.
It's a film that I have often gone to bat for. I feel like most people don't like it as much.
I'm not very familiar with, I've seen The Mummy maybe 2 or 3 times, but it's definitely been a good decade since the last watch.
I think most of the images of like Universal mummies are Lon Chaney Jr. He did, I think, 3 or 4 of them. So like the Karloff mummy is, I think, underappreciated in my opinion. I think it's pretty great.
Can't wait to go on an archaeological dig that reflects the news of the day.
That's right.
Wasn't The Mummy sort of ripped from the headlines?
Yes, it was the first film in the Universal Monsters series that was not based on a book or a story of any other kind. It took advantage of the popularity of King Tut's tomb being discovered. The Egyptian stuff was very popular at the time, so they just decided, okay, that's it. That's what we're doing.
It's like it's been buried for a century. It must be supernatural.
Of course. Yep. So yeah, we'll talk all about that next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter at MonsterMadePod, on Instagram and Facebook at The Monsters That Made Us. And you can email us at themonstersthatmadeus@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Colón. Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can find me at _Mikester on Twitter, and then all the other shows that I'm on at cageclub.me, facebook.com/cageclub, and at cageclubpod on Twitter. Dan, you want to mention our monster swag that we got for sale?
Yes, there are two ways that you can support the show if you would like to do so. The first is you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/themonstersthatmadeus. The swag Mike was talking about, we have t-shirts. Find the link for our TeePublic store on the aforementioned Twitter and Instagram bios. For all other things Cage Club related, just head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. And before we go, we want to wish you all a happy new year. Stay spooky, everybody, and we'll see you again in 2021.